I'm Mel Atkinson, the chair of the Personally Speaking Selection Committee and an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. Thank you so much for joining us for this first presentation of the 11th season of the Personally Speaking series. For 11 years, this series has showcased work published by faculty in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. To date, the series has introduced 43 authors and 41 books to the UNC Charlotte community and beyond, on subjects ranging from bizarre botanicals to political conventions to a goat castle mystery to tonight's topic on drones and support for the use of force. This has only been possible because of the support of a number of key people. I would like to thank Nancy Gutierrez, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, who with the College Advisory Board created Personally Speaking. Since the beginning, Atkins Library has been a valued partner in the Personally Speaking series, and I thank Dean Ann Cooper Moore for her continued support. I would also like to thank Jerry Cotter, Executive Director of the Du Bois Center at Center City, which has been our in-person venue over the past 5 years and a partner for the last 4. We hope to return there soon. Thank you also to the staff members from the class marketing and communication teams who are handling the logistics for this event, and to the emerging media communications team, particularly Natasha Strassner, who's coordinating all of the technology behind the scenes tonight. Finally, I would like to recognize Dr. Joan Lorden, UNC Charlotte Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, and thank her for her support of the Personally Speaking series. Before we begin tonight's presentation, I want to remind you that the next Personally Speaking event will be held Wednesday, October 28th. Dr. Beth Elise Whitaker will talk about how history has shaped the international relations of African states and peoples. Dates for the 2 spring presentations will be announced later this year. We hope you will join us. One additional reminder, attendees can use the chat feature to submit questions to our speaker during the talk, and he will answer as many as he's able to after his prepared remarks. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. James Walsh. Jim is a professor of political science and public administration and an expert on international relations with a focus on peace and conflict studies. He has authored 3 books, including the work he will discuss tonight. He has also published dozens of peer-reviewed articles, many of which were co-authored with UNC Charlotte graduate students. Jim has received major grants for his work from the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Homeland Security, the Minerva Research Institute, and the Army Research Office. This past spring, Jim received the first Citizens Bank Scholars Medal, the university's highest honor for excellence in research. I'm very pleased now to turn over the floor to my friend and colleague, Jim Walsh.
Thank you, Mel. Evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight I want to talk for maybe about 15 minutes or so about this book, Drones and Support for the Use of Force, that I co-authored with Marcus Schultzke. And in this book, we try to understand how the public, the American public, thinks about the use of force and war over the last 7 or 8 years, and how that's influenced by technology. And our sort of frame here is about presidential leadership and presidential decision-making, actually, where presidents face this sort of trade-off when they are leaders during wartime. On the one hand, they want to get reelected, they want to remain popular, but on the other hand, they want to win the war, and those two things can conflict with each other, especially if the war is not going well. So we know from a lot of, for example, political science research that as casualties mount and as there are battlefield losses, presidential popularity declines. So we can think about, for example, if you look at the 3 images on the screen now, the Vietnam War, the Iran hostage crisis, and the Iraq War, they were all wars that led to the loss of the presidency by the occupant at the time. So in this research, we think about how can weapons technology, or modern technology in general, help address this trade-off? So can drones specifically allow presidents to achieve both of these objectives, winning popularity at home, winning election at home, and winning the war overseas? So this is actually a pretty long question in strategic studies and in political science. Proponents of air power more generally have, for almost a century now, suggested that it can both increase the chance of victory in war and reduce the domestic costs of war for leaders. Now, drones are a novel form of air power. In the book, we identify two characteristics that distinguish them from other weapon systems. The first we call selectivity. So this is the idea that drones are particularly effective at finding and hitting targets. So the fact that they don't have an onboard crew means that they can loiter over potential targets and monitor them for long periods of time, hours or days. And they're armed with precision-guided munitions that allow them to precisely target their use of force. The second characteristic is what we call invulnerability. And this also flows from the fact that drones don't have an onboard crew. This eliminates the possibility of direct U.S. casualties, right? So it's possible to fight a war with drones, but suffer no U.S. military casualties. Now, looked at in isolation, these two things seem good in general and particularly good for leaders and make drones an attractive weapon choice for political leaders like presidents. Selectivity increases the likelihood of victory on the battlefield, and invulnerability decreases U.S. casualties, so sort of the costs of conflict. But a lot of concerns have been raised about this and related technologies, one of which you can see on the right of this slide in a statement by Peter Singer of the New America Foundation, who actually visited UNC Charlotte about 8 or 9 years ago, and his visit was a big part of the reason that I got interested in this topic. The question here is really more about one about politics and oversight. Do we actually want the cost of war to the public to decrease, which is something that drones enable? This could have potential negative consequences, allowing leaders to start new wars or to fight wars when the chance of victory is low. So here, there could be a sort of disjuncture between the fact that drones decrease the cost of war and increase the likelihood of victory, and sort of public thinking about or oversight of leaders during wartime. So one way to get at this question about public support for the use of force in the context of drone strikes is to look at public opinion surveys. And so on the right of this slide, we collected about a dozen surveys that were conducted in 2012 and 2013, which was really sort of the height of the drone campaign and when it was getting the most public attention. And you can see, just looking at the support column on the right, that most of these polls report that something like 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans support drone strikes. And as you might know, it's kind of hard to get 2/3 to 3/4 of Americans to agree on just about anything political these days. This is a pretty high level of support for a very controversial decision to use force and go to war. But public opinion surveys, as useful as they are in this context, have some difficulties for the questions that we wanted to answer in the book. One difficulty is they don't really tell us how much the public supports, in this case, drone strikes, compared to other alternatives like diplomatic negotiations or the use of ground troops, which would be vulnerable to casualties. So in the book, we conduct about a dozen survey experiments. So let me just briefly explain sort of the technology here of a survey experiment. It's similar to a randomized control trial that you've heard about in other fields. What we basically do is give the subjects on our experiments, which are in most of them a nationally representative sample of American voters, different pieces of information about a hypothetical conflict, and ask them how much they would support the use of force. So to make this a little bit more concrete, in the survey survey experiment I'll talk mostly about this evening, we present subjects with two attacks, so here labeled attack 1 and attack 2, and on the left of the table you can see we vary the characteristics of the attack, like how it's described. So the objective of the attack can be either prevent genocide or attack terrorist camps, and the mission success can be low, moderate, or high. And here, in this example, we'd be asking someone to compare the characteristics of attack 1 and attack 2, some of which are the same across the two attacks, and ask them which attack they would prefer to carry out if they had the authority to do so, and then on a scale from 1 to 7, how much they would support the attack. Now, we're most interested in variations in the type of attack, right? We vary in this experiment whether the attack is described as being carried out by ground troops, which are vulnerable to casualties, drone strikes, and also airstrikes from manned platforms with an onboard crew. And using some somewhat fancy statistics I won't talk too much about, this is basically the core result. So the figure on the right shows how much support for an attack declines if it compared to an attack carried out by a drone strike, if it's carried out by ground troops or by an airstrike. And you can see that ground troops get about 8% less support than drone strikes do. Now, how big an effect is that? Well, let me talk about that more in a second. I think in general, though, it's a surprisingly small effect, given what the arguments against the use of drones were prior to the publication of our book, right? That people suspected that the size of this effect would be much larger. That is, that the public would be much more enthusiastic about the use of force that involves drones than it does ground troops, probably more than 8%. And actually, in subsequent work with Jared McDonald, who was a postdoc here at UNC Charlotte, using a somewhat different research design, this already small difference actually disappears. So it seems to be a bit contingent on how you design the study. But another way to think about how big this effect is to compare it to other effects. So this figure shows at the bottom the effect of drone strikes compared to ground troops, right? So the figure on this slide that I just showed you is really just that bottom part of this larger figure. And above that, you can see the other factors the multiple other factors that we varied in the experiment, including the type of mission, the likelihood of civilian casualties, and so on and so forth. And just looking at the figure, comparing the part that's in the red circle to the other dots, you can see that the difference between the dotted line and the vertical dotted line and in this case ground troops is actually quite a bit smaller than some of the other characteristics of an attack. So for example, the likelihood that the mission will succeed, when we describe the mission as having a high likelihood of success, not surprisingly, that increases support for the mission pretty substantially by about 20%. And when we describe the attack as likely to cause a large number of civilian casualties, that decreases support by an equally substantial extent, so considerably larger extent than drone strikes do. So the punchline from this line of thinking, these two chapters in the book, are that drones' characteristics of selectivity and invulnerability help increase support for the use of force, but they're not really a magic bullet, right? They don't increase it to 100% or very substantially, only about maybe anywhere from 0 to 8%. And that leaders really need to think about the public's more complex and more complicated decision-making about supporting the use of force, which is influenced by continues to be influenced by many other factors. So another thing we know from political science is that party identification, partisanship matters. Republicans and Democrats in the United States differ pretty substantially on lots of policy choices. And so we then wondered if that mattered in this case as well. And so here I've depicted the overall support for attacks, comparing Republicans and Democrats, where higher numbers towards the right of the scale indicate more support. And you can see that there's a pretty big difference in the distribution of Republicans and Democrats on the top and Democrats on the bottom's ratings of attacks, with Republicans being much more enthusiastic in general about the use of force. So we wondered if this influences attitudes towards drones that are does the fact that Democrats are in general less supportive of the use of force make them particularly less likely to support drone strikes? And so here we have another figure that tries to get at this. The key thing is the part that's circled in red at the top, which shows the difference between Republicans and Democrats. And it really shows that there's very, very small difference in members of the two parties. In other words, they both use this sort of cost-benefit calculation in evaluating attacks and tend to modestly favor attacks with drones over other types of force. And I think this may explain one sort of puzzling characteristic of the drone campaign, which was really started by the second President Bush around 2004 and was substantially increased in terms of its geographic scope to many countries. It originally started really in Pakistan and was expanded to, in a significant way, to Somalia, to Yemen, subsequently to Libya and other countries by President Obama, who also launched many more attacks than his predecessor had done. So this suggests that the appeal to the extent that drones are appealing to leaders, it doesn't depend on party, right? That leaders of both parties have shown a willingness to use this weapon type. Now, a second question I'd like to address before wrapping up is this issue of what's called moral hazard. So you may know of this from, if you remember, the Great Recession of about 10 years ago. Banks and other financial institutions knew that they would get bailed out by the government, and that encouraged them to make more risky investments. And that can apply to policy as well as investments, right? So here, we usually think about war as something that is undertaken as a last resort, right? When there are no good alternatives to war, that's when you use force. But if the costs of war are low, you really don't need to have, you're really not deterred by the absence of good alternatives, right? You might decide to use drone strikes as a first rather than a last resort. And so we wondered if this dynamic operated at the level of the public as well. And so we did another survey experiment, which I'll briefly describe. So this figure on the right sort of shows the 4 types of treatments that we administered in the experiment, varying whether the attack was carried out by a drone strike or by ground troops. And then we also described if there were good or bad alternatives to the use of force in this situation. So good alternatives might be like the Secretary of State in our experiments saying something like, the attack would be likely to succeed, but also negotiations might work as well. And bad alternatives would be somebody like the Secretary of State saying, we don't really see any possibility of negotiating a solution to this problem. So we would expect that, like for ground troops, having good alternatives would really substantially lower support. In other words, the public wouldn't support putting American lives at risk if there were good alternatives to doing so. And so that should have the lowest level of support. Ground troops might be more highly favored when there are no good alternatives, when all the alternatives are bad, right? But the moral hazard argument would suggest that support should not, for drone strikes, should not vary, right? That people would be just as willing to support an attack when there are good alternatives or there are bad alternatives because the costs are relatively low, right? Americans are not put at risk. Drones are usually pretty good at hitting their targets. We actually did not find support for this either, right? So this figure shows the differences between good and bad alternatives across attack types. So for example, the top bar shows ground troops. Ground troops get about 12%, 13% more support when there are no good alternatives to the use of force. The key thing, though, is comparing the 3 bars to each other. They're actually like pretty similar, right? They range from about 9 to 14%. In other words, people don't use a different sort of calculus when they're presented with a drone strike, comparing good and bad options, than when they are comparing an airstrike or ground troops. So again, this suggests that the public is not thinking solely about the immediate costs of conflict, like US military casualties, but also thinking about larger sort of strategic issues. What is the goal of the mission, of the attack? Will civilians be harmed, and things like that? Okay, so let me sum up and then we can move to questions. So the really punchline of our book is that on the one hand, citizens are modestly more supportive of attacks with advanced technology like drones, but not very much, right? That this is unlikely to lead to a dramatically higher support for the use of force, which is what many people, including Marcus and I, worried about and was really like a motivation for writing the book, right? One of the reasons we wrote the book was we wanted to figure out if these concerns were true at the level of public opinion. And we also discovered or reinforced something that we already knew from the literature, which is that the drivers of public support for the use of force are multifaceted and pretty complex, right? So other factors can have a larger impact than, for example, US military casualties. Things like the likelihood of success and the type of mission really matter a lot for the public and can constrain leaders more than the comparison of drone strikes and ground troops do. So I'll just wrap with some longer-term consequences that might be worth thinking about or discussing. So one thing that we did not study in the book is how the media covers drone strikes, right? So the media, of course, also responds to public opinion, and public is are their customers. So they try to have a good sense of what their customers are prioritizing or thinking about in designing their reporting. If the absence of US military casualties when drones are used leads the public to be less interested in a conflict, the conflict itself might get less coverage, and that could minimize its importance or impact in sort of overall political discourse, right? So a good example of this might be the war in Yemen that's been going on since 2010 with substantial US support, including drone strikes, is the biggest humanitarian catastrophe in the world that's caused by conflict. And has been for a number of years, and really doesn't get a lot of traction in American politics, especially the issue of American support for that conflict. Another thing that we've seen shift in the last few years, really since we largely completed the book, is that the strategy of using drones has changed. So now they're often used in conjunction with local allies, ground troops. So they become sort of like the Iraqi or Afghan or Malian Air Force. Their troops are fighting on the ground, and drones and other air elements are supporting them. So this also allows, like this strategy allows the United States to fight wars without putting its own boots on the ground, and that might also allow these conflicts to drag on because they produce, at least in the United States, little political pressure for their resolution. And then the last topic I've been thinking about a lot is how militants who are targeted by drones are likely to adjust their behavior when this happens, right? And maybe I can talk more about that in the Q&A session. But let me go ahead and stop there and turn it back over to Mel and questions from her and from the audience. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We have lots of questions coming in. We'll start with this one. How does your research into insurgent and terrorist groups intersect with this research into drone usage?
Okay, great. Yeah, so I actually have a paper on that that I've been working on for about 9 years. But I think it's pretty good. It just hasn't been published yet. And we look at exactly that question. My co-author, Eric Gartsky, and I, we look at the effects of drone strikes in Pakistan on subsequent militant and terrorist violence. And Pakistan's a really important case here because it's the country where the most drone strikes have occurred, that the US doesn't have ground troops involved as well. And what we find is that drone strikes do influence the militant's subsequent violent behavior, but not in a way that you might expect. So the goal is really to degrade and destroy the militant groups so they can't carry out attacks by killing their leaders and rank and file members. And we find that attacks that kill leaders actually have no effect on subsequent violence, but attacks that kill rank and file militants do. They don't decrease the level of violence, but they actually shift it. So the militants shift from attacking like what we call hard targets, things like military targets, like the Pakistani military, and they engage in more terrorism in large urban centers. And this is really because drones threaten one of their core resources, which is their human resources, their actual soldiers, their militants, right? So drones' ability to kill a large number of militants leads the targeted organizations to respond by trying to preserve those resources and putting them in less danger by having them launch terrorist attacks against civilians in large urban areas. So one thing that also leads to is that the victims change, right? So the victims, instead of being the Pakistani military who are actually fighting the militants, the victims become increased numbers of civilians. So there does seem to be a link here, but maybe it's not the one that we might expect.
All right, thank you, Jim. Is there concern that our enemies might use a drone to attack one of our political leaders in a public place?
Yeah, I think that is a concern. You know, it's if you think about it, drones are a relatively inexpensive and easy to operate technology, right? You can order small commercial grade drones on Amazon. They can carry a small payload of a few pounds. It's not hard to imagine militant organizations using those on the battlefield. In fact, they have in places like Iraq, and also scaling up and acquiring larger military-grade drones. The surprising thing about that is we haven't actually seen many militant or insurgent organizations use drones for terrorist attacks, despite the fact that they seem to be so well suited for it, right? So imagine launching drones at an airport or a crowded stadium and the type of terror and chaos that would create. It hasn't actually happened, or it's happened maybe only once or twice. And so we think that militants probably think about so I have a paper coming out about this as well, in which we think that militants think about this technology the same way that governments and states do. Like, they don't think about it as a way that they can fundamentally transform the conflict, but really as sort of an adjunct to what they're already doing. So they use drones. So for example, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria use drones to monitor enemy military forces, to launch really small-scale attacks in support of their ground troops, but not as a replacement for them.
All right. Do you see the use of AI to allow drones to make independent decisions in the battlefield?
Yeah, this is a pretty hotly debated topic in the Department of Defense and around the world. Autonomous weapons that would not only not have an onboard crew, but would actually have like a computer that's either selecting and identifying and or targets and maybe making decisions about the use of to actually hit those targets. The First of all, the technology isn't quite there yet. There are only a couple of weapon systems that are actually capable of doing this. But one can imagine that technology evolving pretty quickly in the near future. So it's good that the international community is having a debate about this. The consensus seems to be that there should always be what's called meaningful human control over the use of these weapons, so that somehow there's a human being, like a military commander, in the loop that's making ultimate decisions about using deadly force. And that's been a position that's largely been adopted by every country in the world. But at this point, it's still sort of a hypothetical position because these weapons don't exist yet in large numbers. And it will be interesting to see if those weapons are actually developed in a meaningful way, and if the policy about their having a human in the loop were to change once actually using them became a real possibility.
All right, we have two questions that hang together well that are about sort of the abilities of drones. So one is what's the typical endurance and range of a drone? And the other is whether drones have any missile defense systems like military planes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So there are a large number of drones. The drones that I've been talking about are things like the Predator and similar drones. These drones typically can fly for anywhere from 12 to over 24 hours. They're remotely piloted, so the pilots can often be located hundreds or thousands of miles away, and they communicate electronically with and control the drones. And that's a real advantage of the drones. They can just simply fight for longer, but they can, as I suggested earlier, they can also loiter over a battlefield for longer periods of time and select the best time to launch an attack. Those drones, though, don't really have any defensive capabilities, so they've largely been used to date in battlefields where the United States has complete air superiority, where the militants or other armed groups that are being targeted really don't have any capability to shoot down the drones, which do fly at anywhere from like 5,000 to 25,000 feet in the air. That could change, though, as well, right? As more capable drones are developed, they might be able to fly faster and longer, and therefore you could imagine drones fighting with each other in the air, right, to try to achieve air superiority. So that's something that's also of considerable concern as this technology develops.
All right, the next question that we have is about support for drones within the Department of Defense. So is the level of support for the use of drones at the DoD similar to the support in the general citizenry? Would public opinion be able to influence DoD decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we haven't done surveys of military personnel about the use of drones, but I would say a couple of things. So we don't have that kind of data, but when drones started to be introduced, there was a lot of resistance from the, especially from the Air Force, because the Air Force's and pilots' identity in general in the military is that pilots fly airplanes. They're in airplanes when they fly them, right? And the drone pilots are not really facing the same level of risk, and they're also probably not as capable because they're at such a distance, so they can't really surveil the battlefield in the same way that a pilot on an actual aircraft can. That culture has changed pretty significantly, I think, in part because of top-down pressure from the political leadership in the DoD, which recognized the political importance of these new weapon systems. So now drone pilots have wider career paths than they initially did. I think from just talking to people in the military who have worked around drones in various capacities, there's also like a lot of, I want to say skepticism, but a lot of realism about how they can contribute to battlefield success. Just thinking about that question alone, right? That people in the military with this sort of experience recognize that they may contribute in a useful way in some contexts, but they also have shortcomings and problems and are not going to be really sort of the magic bullet that many of their early proponents suggested that they would be.
Do you see differences in support for use of force based on sex?
No, we don't actually. So men and women in our surveys generally respond the same way to the treatments about like the attack type, ground troops versus drones, for example. Which is a little bit surprising because in the political science literature on support for the use of force, there is often a finding of a gender difference.
All right. How much does the public know about how drones are used in various types of conflicts? Do they know the consequences of drone strikes in terms of civilian casualties, military casualties, likelihood of success, precision, and so on, as compared with conventional forms of warfare?
So I guess the short answer to that question would be yes. So as part of our surveys, we actually asked people questions like this. And in general, we got answers that reflected reality. So for example, we asked people, how likely is it that US military personnel would be harmed if this attack was carried out? And the percentage of people that said that military casualties would occur was much higher when we told them about an attack with ground troops than with drones. So that suggests that they do understand that difference. When it comes to things like questions about battlefield success and about civilian casualties, we get much smaller differences. Although I also think that actually reflects reality as well. Like we don't have convincing evidence that drones are more successful than other types of use of force, so we wouldn't expect to see big differences in people's opinions about that, or any differences in their opinion are reflecting like a real difference. And that's true for civilian casualties as well. I think it's very hard to determine if drones cause more or fewer civilian casualties than other types of the use of force in a really convincing way. So yeah, I think the punchline of that line of analysis in our book is that in general, the public has like a pretty good sense of how these things actually work.
All right. Could you say a bit more about how you got interested in this topic? In the introduction, Dr. Atkinson said that you are in a field called peace and conflict studies. How might this research be used to promote conflict resolution and peace?
Yeah, great question. So I got interested, I think I mentioned this briefly, I got interested about 7 or 8, maybe 8 or 9 years ago when Peter Singer from New America came to UNC Charlotte and gave a talk about a book he had about drones, where he laid out many of these arguments about their consequences for public opinion and many other aspects of warfare. So I started doing some research then, and part of that culminated in the book with Marcus. And this is part of a larger shift in my career to look at peace and conflict studies, or what's actually often called in our field peace science. And the idea is basically we can use social scientific methods to understand the consequences of warfare for civilians, for example. So I spend a lot of time doing things like collecting data and analyzing data and conducting experiments like the ones I talked about today, so that we have a better understanding of the drivers of conflict and also the drivers of peace. And hopefully that has the potential to anyways inform public debate and policy discussion about these issues.
Do your surveys or other researchers you know of consider perspectives of civilians on the ground who might be near a drone target, even if not close enough to be collateral damage, for whom drone attacks become a form of terrorism? Does this turn people against the US, perhaps in a terrorist direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's sort of the backfire argument, the argument that when the US uses force, especially the use of force that kills civilians, it will lead people in the targeted country to not support the US. And there's actually been a pretty large amount of research on this exact question because it's so interesting and it's so important for policy, right? And I think that the findings are mixed. That there's some papers report that backlash effect does occur, others do, including some of my own work, but others do not. So I'm not really sure that we really know in a scientific way the answer to this question. And I think one reason for that is that sort of research is, very hard to carry out. It's very hard for especially Western researchers, but really any researchers, to get on the ground access to places like parts of Iraq or Syria or Northwest Pakistan where drone strikes are occurring, because carrying out these studies puts them in considerable danger themselves.
You talked about using drones in place of military personnel. Are military conflicts really winnable with drone strikes only, or are special forces and intelligence personnel needed on the ground?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's some variation across conflicts. So, for example, in Pakistan, the U.S. had kind of a conflictual relationship, both conflictual and cooperative relationship with Pakistan when it was carrying out large numbers of drone strikes. On the one hand, the Pakistani government complained about these publicly, but on the other hand, they basically didn't shoot down the drones when they entered their airspace. So in that case, it was much more difficult for the U.S. to have a very large and opened on-the-ground presence that could help with the drone strikes. And that kind of raises the larger question that's here, which is that can you actually win a conflict with drones alone, right? Can you destroy, for example, a militant group with drones alone? I don't think that, I think some of the research that I've done and others have done have suggested that that's unlikely to work, right? Because the militants are adaptive, right? They're strategic actors as well, and they will change their behavior to counter the effects of drone strikes. In other conflicts, this does happen. So for a good example is the battle for Mosul and Raqqa, cities in Iraq and in Syria that were controlled by the Islamic State, in which the United States deployed drones as well as other forms of air power in conjunction with forces on the ground to really precisely, well, to target, maybe I shouldn't say precisely, but to try and precisely target Islamic State strongholds in those cities as they were liberated by Iraqi and Syrian ground forces.
The media reported that some of the pilots who fly drones experienced severe PTSD from the process of loitering before and after a drone strike. Do you think that if the public were more aware of these effects on military personnel, that they would be less supportive?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, right? Because when we think about U.S. military casualties, we typically think about U.S. military personnel dying in conflicts. And actually, the number of U.S. military personnel who die in conflicts has declined really substantially since like the Vietnam era. But the number who suffer long-term physical injuries has gone up pretty dramatically, largely because of improvements in battlefield medicine, right? So it's more likely that someone, U.S. military personnel who are harmed will survive than it was 50 years ago. And so there's some question about if people recognize that and that influences their support for the use of force, basically by lowering the cost of conflict in their eyes. I think it's a different question entirely about the sort of psychological consequences of conflict for service members and then for the public perception of that, right? So I think we've learned an enormous amount about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in part because it's so commonplace in the U.S. military after the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
All right. Are drones visible on radar? And if small and they fly 5 to 25,000 feet, are they visible to eyes on the ground?
Yes to both questions. So the types of drones that have been used in these campaigns are actually like pretty low-tech affairs in some ways, right? Some of them are propeller-driven aircraft. They don't have defensive mechanisms. They don't have armor. They are visible from the ground if they're flying at a low enough altitude. So people in areas where drone flights are, these military drone flights are common, like northwest Pakistan, have complained about sort of like a near constant buzzing over their villages. And they are detectable on radar as well. So that's kind of interesting because in most of the conflicts, the United States has used drones. As I mentioned, they've had air superiority. So the militants that they're targeting don't have any radar capabilities to speak of, certainly no capabilities to shoot down the drones. One exception to that, as I suggested, is Pakistan. So the Pakistani military does have quite advanced air capabilities, most of which it bought from the United States. So it was able to track drone incursions into its territory, and in principle could have shot down those drones pretty easily, but due to somewhat secret political agreements with the United States, decided not to do so because they basically agreed they agreed with the military objectives of the campaign, but for public opinion reasons, they had to object publicly to it.
This next question is about your experiments. In your experiments, what information were participants given about the conflict the US military was engaging in? Are there certain types of conflicts or certain parts of the world where people respond with higher or lower levels of support for the use of force?
Yeah, so we conducted most of these experiments between about 2014 and 2017, and to make the questions a little bit more realistic for the subjects, for the participants, we typically used a real-world example from the world at the time, right? So drone strikes or ground troops in places like Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen were the examples that we used. And we thought that that was worth it because it would make those descriptions a little bit more realistic and a little bit more sort of visceral to the participants in the experiments. The cost, though, is that we don't really know about we don't really know the answer to this question, right? If we were describing attacks that took place in, say, Russia or Africa or Latin America, if the answers would have been substantially different. We ultimately decided that doing that would be interesting, but would have made the experiments kind of very obviously unrealistic to the participants, and that was not worth it for what we wanted to do.
All right. Do we ask for permission for the use of airspace by the countries where the target is located, or are we violating their sovereignty?
It depends. So Pakistan is kind of a good example. Like in Pakistan, the Pakistanis never gave formal authorization for the United States to launch drones into the country. Most of those drones were based in Afghanistan. But they did in a de facto way, right? So they did not shoot down the drones. They actually cleared air corridors that the drones could fly in and that no other aircraft could fly in. So in effect, we didn't get their formal permission, but we got their informal permission. In most of the other conflicts, there has in practice been formal permission from, for example, the government of Iraq. But in others, there is not. So the government of Syria certainly never authorized U.S. airstrikes in the country, and that's essentially true for Somalia as well. So that is sort of like, from a leader's perspective, that might be one nice characteristic of these weapons, is that you can violate another country's sovereignty and airspace, and if you get caught, the costs are low, in the sense that if you had a manned, an aircraft with an onboard crew and that was shot down and those crew members were killed or captured, that would escalate the issue to a much higher level. You may remember about a little over a year ago, a U.S. drone was shot down over Iran, was shot down by the Iranians. And President Trump ultimately decided not to retaliate because he said it's just a drone, right? The cost of this loss is relatively low, so it's not worth escalating the conflict with Iran.
That leads well into another question that's come in. It's described as a real long-term hypothetical. So will ground-based robot drones eventually replace ground troops? And if so, you can imagine almost entirely drone-based warfare. What will be the cost of a drone war? And will the increasing use of drones counterintuitively lead to more civilian targeting as adversaries seek to increase the cost of war for their opponents?
Yeah, it's a fascinating hypothetical, right? And there are already not drone soldiers, but drones that assist soldiers, right? So remotely piloted vehicles that move on the ground and at sea, actually. But to the extent that ground troops are replaced by technology, basically, right, that is going to substantially lower some of the costs of conflict that I talked about, right? And then, as the question suggests, that raises the issue of how do you actually impose costs on your opponent to get them to back down? Right? One way is to have a better drone army than they do, right? So you can wipe out their battlefield army, their drone battlefield army, and then implicitly threaten their civilian population. But another that requires like prevailing in the conflict, though. And if that's not possible, another option would be to target civilians directly, as you suggest. Right? So that would be a worrying possibility.
Do you think your work might influence drone use or DoD policy? And if so, how?
Well, I'd like to think so, but I also like to think that political leaders are actually, in many cases, pretty smart and have already figured out some of these issues. And so a good example of what I'm thinking about there would be how the Obama administration handled the issue of drone strikes, but especially drone strikes that inadvertently killed civilians. So over the course of the Obama administration, they got a lot of criticism about this, both from overseas and from some domestic critics. And they recognized many things about that, but I think one of the things they recognized was that if this issue got like a very large amount of public attention, the president would get criticized for it, right, and would suffer a decline in popularity. So before they could, recognizing that possibility, they redesigned the program so that it would focus more on, or would have more rules about when drones could be used to attack areas where civilians were located. So they try to kind of get in advance of that criticism by changing their behavior in warfare.
Did you have any military veterans or military family members in your sample for your studies? And if so, do you see more or less support for drone use among these people?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. In some of the studies, we did ask questions about military background, I should say, by both the person who was answering the survey as well as their family members. We didn't actually find very substantial differences between veterans or people with military experience in their family compared to people without it, which was actually like kind of surprising. Although on the other hand, I'm not really sure which way we would expect that to drive people. I'm not actually convinced that people with military experience would be more supportive of drones because, as I suggested earlier, it might be more obvious to them what some of the limitations of the technology are.
How have other countries reacted to our use of drones in the conflicts that you describe?
Yeah, so they've gotten drones of their own, right? So there are now dozens of countries in the world that have military-grade drones, either imported from the United States or other pioneers in this technology like Israel. And increasingly, countries have started to develop their own drones. And that's a relatively straightforward process compared to other advanced military technologies, certainly things like nuclear weapons, but even compared to things like cruise missiles or ballistic missiles. The type of drones we've been talking about are relatively simple pieces of technology. They're basically a simple airframe that's remotely controlled. That's a technology that's been around for decades. Coupled with an advanced communication system between the ground controller and the drone itself. That part is a little bit more complicated, but that technology is also commercially available and widely diffused. And then a precision-guided munition like a Hellfire missile, which is also pretty common on international markets. So really, it's not too difficult for countries that have less advanced industrial capabilities, countries like Iran, for example, to rather quickly develop their own drone fleets, which they've done over the last 7 to 10 years or so.
How have concerns about civilian casualties influenced drone campaigns?
Yeah, so I think that this has been a really important factor in drone strikes. Maybe a good example would be Pakistan's. So which, as I mentioned, is the country that has had until recently the most drone strikes where there weren't U.S. ground troops involved. And in Pakistan, there was a lot of outrage around 2009 to 2013 about drone strikes, and in particular about civilian casualties from drone strikes, that the U.S. was using them indiscriminately and not caring about the loss of Pakistani lives if it was saving American lives from not having to have troops on the ground there. A lot of that was for political motives, political opponents of the Pakistani government at the time, or supporters of the militant groups would make these arguments pretty effectively. And I think it actually did have a pretty substantial effect on constraining U.S. policy, that the U.S. government recognized that there could be this sort of blowback, and they revised their rules of engagement to try to minimize civilian casualties. And as I mentioned earlier, I also think that there was a domestic impact of that as well, that the Obama administration in particular worried that this could become an issue that would divide them from their natural supporters, and if it got a lot of attention, and revise their policies accordingly about how they use drones.
Which of your findings have most surprised you in this research?
Yes, many of them. I think like the sort of core findings of the book were rather surprising for us, for my co-author Marcus and I. You know, we sort of, I think going into it, we expected that drones would get much more public support than, for example, ground troops, especially given the context in which we were conducting these studies. You know, in the like 2014, 2015, 2016, this was a period after the United States had been involved in two large and deadly ground wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, in which it did not really prevail. And that people would really be turned off to the use of force and would therefore use of ground troops, and would therefore see drones as like a really attractive alternative way to achieve the same military objectives without risking U.S. military personnel. We didn't find that, right? I think that the punchline is that there's a modest increase in support when drones are involved, but we actually were surprised by that, and also surprised by many of the other factors that mattered. So, for example, in many of our experiments, Americans' concerns about civilian casualties were much more important than their concerns about the use of drones.
Somebody has supplied us with what looks like a great final question, which is, what is next in your research?
So next, I'm still trying to publish the first paper I wrote on drones, which I started about 9 years ago. I'm hoping that might happen in the near future. So continuing to do some research on this topic. I've also switched to other topics. So my current research is largely about refugees and people who are displaced by conflict. We know a lot about why people are displaced, how conflict displaces people. We don't really know what happens to people after they're displaced. So with a team of investigators in the US and Europe, we're doing surveys and survey experiments, which are not too dissimilar to the ones I talked about today, among displaced people in places like Turkey and Iraq and Nigeria, to see how they're thinking about returning to their homes, under what conditions they would do so, and also the sort of mental health consequences of experienced conflict and how that influences their political attitudes and willingness to cooperate with people from other ethnic and religious groups, which we see as that sort of cooperation is quite important for rebuilding these societies after conflict.
That sounds interesting. Thank you so much, Jim. We appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for joining us for this Zoom conference. You'll be getting an email asking you to fill out an evaluation, and we would really appreciate your feedback. Please join us on October 28th for Beth Whitaker's presentation on Africa's international relations. We hope to see you then. Thank you so much.